One of the most shocking and historic moments in European history was when the French king made his way to the scaffold on the 21st of January 1793 in Paris. He had been found guilty of high treason and for this was beheaded by the guillotine, but King Louis XVI did not die a king. He had been stripped of the title and the monarchy was abolished in September 1792 with the First French Republic proclaimed. His wife Marie Antoinette would later follow him to the scaffold, but Louis's execution was a rather swift and brutal moment in history. To execute a king was an incredibly severe thing to have done. But what is the story of his execution? Join us today as we look at the brutal execution of King Louis XVI of France. And remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. King Louis ascended onto the throne in 1774 when he was 19 years old, and he inherited a country already in turmoil. At the time the government was grossly in debt, and there was a growing resentment in France of the monarchy. He doubted his ability to deal with issues, and he did wish to be liked by the population, saying, "It may be considered politically unwise, but it seems to me to be a general wish, and I want to be loved." He was determined to do his best and to be a good king, and he wished to consult the public on a number of affairs, but his reign was plagued with poor decisions, scandal and economic suffering. Louis did accept attempts by his ministers to relieve the economic issues in France, but one of the biggest issues was that Louis was in support of the colonists in the American War of Independence, and by providing financial support to them, it plunged France to the verge of bankruptcy. He himself was seen as a big spender in the country, and at the time his population were beginning to suffer greatly. There was a crisis with people not being able to afford food and to pay for it, leading to people starving. In a last-ditch attempt to solve the financial problems, Louis assembled the Estates General, the National Assembly that represented the free estates or classes of the French people, the nobility, the clergy and the commoners. This had not been gathered for over 170 years, but the commoners used it to declare itself the National Assembly, and beginning the spark of the French Revolution. To the French people, Louis and his Queen Marie Antoinette were seen as lavish spenders, and Marie also began to become a figure of hatred, as she was known for spending huge sums of the country's money on decorations, furniture, clothes, and extravagant things for herself. Whilst the people were suffering, Marie and Louis were having banquets, and this was seen as grossly inappropriate. The storming of the Bastille occurred on the 14th of July 1789, where protesters in Paris stormed the state prison, seen as a symbol of the monarchy's power, and they broke in to ransack the prison and to steal weapons and ammunition. This was seen as a huge moment in the revolution, and things continued to go downhill after this. In October 1789, an angry mob marched on Versailles and forced the royal couple to move. Louis tried to escape in June 1791, and this was seen that he was betraying the French people and consulting with foreign powers to deal with the rebels, but he was captured and was forced to accept a new constitution. In August 1792, the royal couple were arrested and were then imprisoned separately. Louis was arrested on the 13th of August and was sent to the Temple, an ancient fortress used in Paris as a prison, and within weeks the National Assembly declared France a republic and abolished the monarchy. The king was kept under arrest and was seen as a hostage, but he was also seen as dangerous, as it was predicted invading forces would try and save him. Evidence was found about his negotiations with Austria and other foreign countries, and for this the king was placed on trial. On the 11th of December 1792, he was taken from his prison to stand before the convention and to hear the charges put before him. Before the trial began, he tried to mount his defence, and he told his lawyers that he knew he would be found guilty and would be killed. He was resigned to accept his fate, and he knew what was coming, but he wanted to go down fighting. There were 3 questions that the convention were voting on. The first was, is Louis guilty? The second was, should there be an appeal to the people? And the third was, what should the punishment be for him? On the 15th of January 1793, the convention began to vote, and in total it took 36 hours to reach a decision. Louis was found overwhelmingly guilty, but there was a significant problem as to what the punishment should be. By just one vote, the sentence of death was passed for Louis, and he was condemned to death by just one single vote. A reprieve was voted down the next day, and it was voted that his execution should be conducted as swiftly as possible. His execution was scheduled for the 21st of January 1793, and his death sentence was rather controversial. To many it was seen as bringing the long-awaited end of the 1,000-year period of absolute monarchy in France and the beginning of democracy in the nation. Others saw it as a senseless act of bloodshed, and that it showed France was heading towards a violent and immoral society. On the morning of his execution, Louis woke early. He dressed with the help of his valet, Jean-Baptiste Clary, and he then went to meet with an Irish priest, Henry Essex Edgeworth, and made his last confession. Here he heard his last mass and was given communion. The priest advised Louis to avoid saying goodbye to his family, as it would be too difficult, and at 7 o'clock he passed his final wishes on to the priest. The royal seal was to go to the Dauphin, and his wedding ring to Marie, his queen. He then went to meet the commander of the guard, and in the second court a green carriage waited for him. He climbed aboard it, with the priest and 2 guards who sat opposite them. The carriage carrying the king left Temple at 9 o'clock, and for more than an hour drummers played to drown out any support that there was for the king. They then escorted the carriage through Paris. The route was lined with 80,000 men at arms, and the cavalry who led the carriage had their sabres drawn. There was a plot to try and break the king out to save him by royalists, but this never came to anything. At 10 o'clock the carriage arrived at the Place de la Revolution, and here a scaffold had been created with a guillotine standing on it. It was surrounded by soldiers, who had guns and drums, and also a crowd who were armed with pikes and bayonets. He was approached by the executioner Sanson, who along with his assistants tied Louis's hands together. The king's hair was then cut to ensure that the execution went swiftly, and he then removed his shirt collar and was led up to the scaffold by the executioner. It was said by his priest that the path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone. 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Whilst on the scaffold, Louis tried to give a long speech, but a drum roll was ordered, and this led to his execution being quickened. The noise made his speech hard to understand, and with this he was then fastened quickly to the guillotine's bench. With Louis strapped to the board, he was then swiftly slid under the guillotine's yoke to hold his head in place. Once a signal was given that he was in position, the blade was released, and it quickly beheaded him. The executioner Sanson then grabbed the severed head of the king out of the basket, where it fell, and showed it to the cheering crowd. One report said that the blade did not sever his neck, and instead cut through the back of his skull and into his jaw, but as the king's head was shown, a number of the crowd rushed to the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. Executioner Charles Henry Sanson told of the events that day. Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked why the drums had stopped beating. He came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, "My people, I die innocent." Then turning towards his executioners, Louis declared, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sanson then showed the head of Louis to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Viva la Nation," "Viva la Republique," arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another account recited to French author Victor Hugo stated, "Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4. 2 only performed the execution, the 3rd stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon, which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold." The executioners wore breeches, coats in the French style as the Revolution had modified it, and 3-cornered hats with enormous tricolor cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sanson, Seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. Louis XVI's body was then transported to the old church of the Madeleine, and it was buried. It was said that arriving at the cemetery I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was then thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by the earth, the whole being firmly and throughoutly tampered down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. Later his remains and his queen's were reburied together inside the Basilica of Saint Denis. The execution of King Louis XVI was a pivotal moment in the history of France. It symbolised the end of the corrupt monarch that had been bleeding the country dry in the subsequent decades before, and the beginning of the revolution that led to democracy. France did suffer in the years following, with turmoil and many more executions coming, but the king's, along with his wife's, was seen as the most significant. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.